Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I feel I need to be super enthusiastic now. I'm glad I had time in the break to go and tie away my dreadlocks and get rid of my Jesus sandals because the Brigadier is still in the front row. So I just wanted to, but feel safe. I'm not going to bandy around any logos or put any visibility constraints on you. I found today so amazingly interesting, so thank you so much for the invitation and for sharing your views. I think this is something we don't talk about enough, I think, in the NGO community, actually. We may talk about it in after-action reviews and other things, but I think actually hearing about how you make important ethical decisions and how we feel as people, as we all are, making these decisions is really important. So just a quick clarification, Humanitarian Advisory Group is a social enterprise, not an NGO. So I wanted to let you know I have worked with international and local NGOs, and I'll be speaking from that experience today. But I am wearing a humanitarian advisory hat, and the comments that I'll be making are my own today. So we're an organisation that supports humanitarian organisations in policy development and training, but we focus very much on civil-military interaction. So the reason why I was so pleased to be invited to this conference, that although we can often talk about how different the humanitarian community and being a part of the NGOs are from the military, actually we have some pretty core things in common, which is we both face serious ethical dilemmas when we're in the field. And oftentimes decisions that we make, or decisions that we don't make, that the Brigadier very articulately mentioned, can have life or death implications. Yes, from a NGO point of view, these may be very much more indirect than military ones, but it is a case that we face very difficult decisions and dilemmas in this way as well. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples, because I think if military actors in general can understand a little bit more about the ethical dilemmas that NGOs face, we may have a little better working relationship when we come across one another in theatre. So if people can understand, military operators in theatre have often said to me, or at times, we understand you can't access, X area. We're able to provide you with armed escorts, with vehicles, with even air assets if you want to access that area, conduct an assessment, or even move humanitarian assistance to that area. And explaining the backstory as to why that's not always possible or preferable. I think if we can get to that understanding quickly and in peacetime, as we call it, then we can work much better together in the field. So the kind of dilemmas that NGOs face, things like accessing affected populations, and it's not just from a logistical sense. When I worked with Oxfam Australia and was deployed to Sri Lanka at the end of the war there, it was quite interesting. I had actually a colleague from CARE say to me, "So how do you feel about being complicit in running a concentration camp?" And I said, And it was a very uncomfortable feeling, knowing we were in charge of WASH, water and sanitation, trucking water to certain, and these were large camps, 300,000 people. End of the war, there's just been 40,000 people slaughtered. We're having highly traumatised people in these camps, children being drawn out and being sent to re-education camps, not a great situation. And what was happening is Oxfam was moving water to the gate of the camp, and then the Sri Lankan military were taking that and distributing it within the camp. So it meant that we didn't have any visibility around how it was being distributed. Was it being distributed to people who needed it most? And that was happening for some time. And we were getting a lot of criticism. Why don't you pull out? Why don't you pull out and go public? And it was interesting, when I had that conversation back at headquarters, some other people had said, if we pull out, the Chinese will just cover it. It won't make any difference at all. So again, these are not black and white decisions that we have. And I think that's something, again, that we should... It's nice that we can actually talk about it in a space like this, because it's true, and rather than us sort of going off in other directions, ethical stuff is something that we have in common, I believe. So today I want to talk a little bit about, who NGOs are, the kind of context that we're meeting them, and where this debate is going on a global level. I've just come back from Turkey and some very interesting meetings at the World Humanitarian Summit, and talking to UN actors who are pulling together some new initiatives to try and move things forward in this area. So I'm sure all of you are aware that in terms of humanitarian needs, and when I talk about the humanitarian community, I'm talking about UN agencies, NGOs and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. The humanitarian community are faced with a massively growing caseload, and as I mentioned, the summit that's just been held in Istanbul was the first ever UN humanitarian summit that has been held in the 70 years in the life of the UN. And this was really trying to work out, is the international humanitarian system fit for purpose? There is a question going around, is it broke or is it just plain broken? So there were some very interesting discussions around that, and it was a UN summit, so of course no decisions were actually made. But I would like to think that perhaps some of the right questions were asked and that, you know, the debate will progress and perhaps some changes will be made. One interesting thing that came out and is very relevant to NGOs is asking donor countries to, when they're giving humanitarian assistance, that at least around 20% of that is going to go directly to local NGOs, which will cause many donor governments large headaches because of their transparency and accountability mechanisms they need when they're giving taxpayer dollars. So we'll see where that goes. So again, the trends that we're seeing is actually that there are fewer crises in number, but these are chronic, longer term, and affecting many more people. And on this slide you can see, Hyan is mentioned, the impact of climate change is something that's having a big impact on the humanitarian community and how it reacts, both from a disaster risk reduction point of view, but also from a response point of view as well. So when we look at a humanitarian response, a whole bunch of actors, and there are both on this slide international and national NGOs. So globally, around about 4,500 of these working just in the humanitarian space. Today I'm just talking about NGOs focused on, you know, disaster response and humanitarian response, because these are the ones you guys are going to be coming across in the field, in operations, rather than those that are focused on long-term development projects internationally. And you can see there's military forces, diaspora groups. Private sector is also something that's an interesting rub point for the humanitarian community. More and more private sector companies being involved in response, and I think this is something we're trying to shape what that actually is going to look like. So out of those 4,500 NGOs, 4 out of 5 of them are local NGOs. And often you can arrive in a country and just assume, oh, there's no one working here, or there's... But I mean, as soon as you start actually talking to communities and finding out that there are organic grassroots groups working on many, many different issues. So who are they? Does anyone want to take a stab about who are the big 5, the top 5 international mega NGOs, if you like, international mega NGOs at the moment? Yes, that's one. No, that's a UN agency. So any other international NGOs? Hang on. No, Red Cross. Oh, that's a good one. Red Cross is not an NGO. Yes. Amnesty, no. No, used to be, but not anymore in the latest report. No. Yes. Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the biggest ones, which has tripled its budget in the last 4 years, is the International Rescue Committee, now headed up by Miliband out of New York. So we're looking at, and MSF is the really big one actually. And of course, you know, with MSF, they're a very interesting case in the way that they generally don't take money from donor governments. So when they can self-righteous bash the rest of us NGOs, they actually do have, you know, a platform to stand on, and we can say, oh yeah, we took DFAT money. We can't say anything about that. So it's quite interesting. They, as you would know, some focus on geographical issues, some have a very narrow focus, some are very, very grassroots, some are massive. I mean, an organisation like World Vision has more staff than the World Food Programme actually. So they're massive, they're very big. They also implement more than 80% of the UN's work. So when the World Food Programme or UNICEF get a large pot of money and they do their humanitarian programming, they pretty much always will subcontract that to NGO partners to implement. And a big international NGO like Oxfam will then subcontract to a local partner for that to happen. So there's a lot of criticism around actually how that works, as everyone takes their cut along the way. Generally, the agencies that I'm speaking to in terms of looking at emergency response and humanitarian situations strive to work to these principles. And I think some of the the discussion that was had this morning, Professor, around some of the points you raised is very interesting, because there is talk around how these 4 principles are interpreted in different cultures and by different organisations. I'm speaking very much, if I'm honest, from a very Western point of view of how big Western-based international NGOs interpret these particular principles and how they work and how they're adhered to. These principles are seen as ensuring both access and safety of affected populations in crisis, but they are contested, and there are constantly discussions around, in the current environment, are they still relevant? My opinion would be they're more relevant than ever, and we're just trying to find ways in which we can adhere to them in the best way. So when it comes to NGO and their ethics, they have a lot of interesting decisions to make, and just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that you made, Brigadier, which are really interesting and very, very valid indeed. You were mentioning the visibility of people going around trying to fly their particular NGO flags. On the flip side of that, I will say, I don't think I'm speaking out of school, there was a time where the donors are chasing the NGOs, wanting them to work in very particular areas. So I do recall getting a phone call once from someone with a blank checkbook saying, would you work in Uruzgan only, please? And Oxfam at that stage saying, no, I don't think so. We'd work on a general national program on a needs-based approach in Afghanistan, but not just in that particular one province. However, one international NGO did take up that project, and it's the largest NGO project in Australian history, which is a big one with Save the Children. And I will say that caused some interesting relationships and some frictions within the NGO community itself, because I think there was probably a misguided assumption that we were all on the same page of, you know, what would happen if such an offer were made. But that was $34 million over 4 years, and it really did change the landscape in some ways of how people work. And it's not just money, there's also flows of information and other kind of things, but NGOs are often in a position where they are offered assets that can be incredibly helpful for them in their work, and trying to make those decisions around, sure, in the short term, this could be wonderful. We could move people, we could do an assessment, we can provide assistance, we can do what we need to do. But in the long term, what does that mean about the perceptions of us in this particular community? When I worked in Afghanistan with the UN, there was a particular NGO who had one member of ISAF actually use their office as a detention centre, which was not ideal. They had detainees brought in, gagged and blindfolded and handcuffed and just told, we have to use your office now. This NGO is a British NGO and had operated in that particular district for 9 years, building relationships and building their programs. And after this instance, of course, that was the end of that. Interestingly, top brass at ISAF were horrified at this, and that was, I guess, something good that came out of that situation. The channels of communication were very open in terms of NGOs and the military in that particular context. But you can see that all these kind of issues here, and there have been claims by very senior, often politicians, who talk about NGOs as our eyes and ears on the ground. These kind of comments that are massively unhelpful when you're an operational agency. So again, NGOs are incredibly diverse, which makes them often very difficult to work with, because what works for one will not work for another. What one will focus on is not one will focus on. Their priorities will be different, their areas will be different. Their structure will be incredibly different as well. So they do work to certain codes of conduct. So the Australian Council for International Development, for example, has a code of conduct that all its members adhere to, and they also have organisational ones as well. There are also standards. You will have probably heard about the SPHERE standards, which are humanitarian response standards. There are new accountability standards, which again touch on, I think, the situation was very dire in Rwanda, and I think that recognition of the NGOs not being at that level of professionalism. And that, plus the Indian Ocean tsunami response and the crisis in Darfur, are what triggered the humanitarian response review, a massive review, which is then what preceded the cluster approach being rolled out, as well as looking at what does good humanitarian leadership look like. So again, similar kind of aspects that are raised from a military point of view in terms of having good leaders are absolutely critical. So in terms of how NGOs like to work with military actors, it varies very much from when you're working in a natural disaster, when you're working in a conflict situation, as you would know. So pretty much you're working along a continuum, and it is the UN that is going to be the interface between that. This is something that NGOs actually don't seem to be wholly aware of often. They often think, who should I talk to DFAT? And then they'll guide me in the right direction to the military. But if you are in most large-scale response operations, there will be someone from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They will be your UN SIMCORD person. It's up to them to be that interface and provide a safe and neutral space for military and humanitarian actors to come together to meet. MSF will never come to the meetings. I think people have just given up on inviting them. My view is humanitarian civil-military coordination, that dialogue, is essential and it is best practice, even if you only want to come to the meeting to say to military, I don't want anything to do with you. But I think you have to have that initial opening of the communication channels, so at least everyone is on the same page. I wanted to just let you know of a couple of resources if you're interested in this area. OCHA have just updated the handbook. There's all the different globally agreed guidelines are included in this. These are decision-making tools for leaders when you're trying to work out should military assets be used. When an NGO comes to you and says, can you move this from there? You need to ask them, have you explored all commercial avenues first? It's not a case of being able to just use military assets whenever you like. There are globally agreed guidelines on how this is done. And also there's an Australian handbook put together by the Australian Civil Military Centre, which goes through, it's very regionally specific, and it's great in terms of definitions, mechanisms, who's who, and how you can work together. So I recommend looking at that if you're interested. Thank you very much. My last couple of points around, there's a lot of areas that I think NGOs and militaries can actually work on constructively in peacetime in Australia. One is the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which Defence is heavily involved in. And the civil society reports just come out around recommendations of where that can go, and I think that's a nice synergy. Working on it from different areas. Same with protection of civilians in armed conflict. NGOs work on this, so do military. They work on it very differently, but there are some common areas of discussion. So these are just a couple of challenges to leave you with, and I know I was talking to Dean about this. I think there actually civil military coordination mechanisms are well developed. There are people to pick up the phone to when you work with an NGO and you have a problem. Not so much with our private military and security contractor friends. When something goes wrong there, there's no one to call. And sometimes it can go very badly wrong. And because of the way they are perceived on operations, they're kind of half military, half not. They're carrying weapons, that they don't... it's very unclear who they're not working for a state, they may be working for a private organisation. This is very problematic for humanitarian actors, and they are becoming more and more prevalent in that space. So I think even though there are international codes of conduct, they are still voluntary and there are not communications there. So that's one area. And the other one is just the sheer number I mentioned, number of NGOs, and how I understand that's difficult for militaries to sort of keep track and understand that even though there are global consortiums for NGOs, umbrella organisations that you can actually tap into, and you can actually speak with a lot of NGOs very easily just through one contact. Ensuring that that is made known for people when they're operating is something that can make life a bit easier, I think. And just on the common standards, so the UN are putting together a very handy little field guide that will be common standards for humanitarian civil military coordination. There's a massive advisory group with from militaries all around the world on that. And hopefully that'll be something that will be useful for you. And also looking just at the Asia Pacific, there is a new group that's looking very much at planning for emergencies and how militaries work and can interface on a bilateral basis, looking at humanitarian crises there. So a lot is going on, and I'd be very happy to take I think we're going to take questions afterwards, are we, Tom, on the panel? Yep, great. Oh, we take them now? Sure, great. So if you have any questions, let me know.
So do you think it's fair to say that NGOs don't play well together?
I think they're realising that to be a professional organisation, you don't have a choice. If you are wanting to do accountable, effective, well-coordinated work, which is what is expected more and more now of those agencies, and there is more transparency around that there has to be. That being said, there's always going to be outliers, but I have heard someone say in a presentation once, that's not a bad thing. It builds redundancy into your system. So if someone's an outlier, we've got our nice, neat coordination system here, and there's a few people out here. Actually, that's okay. But I strongly feel that it is not acceptable not to share what you're doing, how and where, when you're in an operation, to ensure that there's not duplication and to ensure that you're having coordinated approaches.
So was Rwanda a low point?
There's been many low points. I don't know if that's the lowest, but when I worked in Liberia, there was some fairly low things happening there in terms of, I mean, everyone always bangs on about peacekeepers a lot, and sure, there was a lot of, sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, but there were a lot by NGO workers as well. We had international NGOs being packed up and shipped home because they were running child trafficking rings. So that's within the last decade. So I would like to say that there was a low point. It was only up from there, but I couldn't say that.
Thank you. Your questions, please. And a question over here. Thank you.
G'day, Dave Cave from the Army. First of all, Beth, thank you for your presentation, and can I say that from my own personal experiences in South Sudan last year, that the UN and NGO cooperation has come a long way, and I saw some great work being done using the cluster system. Mm-hmm. So that was reaffirmed some of my faith in the system, if you like. But in a wider context, we've seen a lot of nations start to tie their aid budgets to their national aims. Our former AusAid inserted in the national interest into their mission statement. I noticed the British equivalent of the White Paper talks about soft power as being one of their levers that they can pull, and they've rolled their aid budget in. How has the flow of that money into the NGO community affected the relationships between those different NGOs and how they work with the UN?
That's a very good question, David. A couple of things. Firstly, on how aid from government donors is given, counter-terrorism legislation has had a really big impact on what NGOs can do and with whom, especially in areas around Palestine and also in Syria and others, cross-border operations, and a lot of these aspects have become really tricky, and World Vision had a really tricky time a couple of years back on some of the work that they were doing. Also in Sri Lanka, there were issues around that as well. So that's one piece. One thing I would say that at least Australia and the UK and the US and others, although I know there's criticisms around the politicisation of aid, they are still part of very large donor mechanisms that have the good humanitarian donor principles and other kind of checks and balances. New and emerging, or what we could call non-traditional donors, such as China and the Gulf states, have a huge pot of money that they are also utilising, and that's not going through any of those mechanisms, which is a concern. And I think it's also difficult then to be able to try and work out what the flows of funding actually look like going into countries, because they want them very much just to be bilateral, and they don't put into the big UN shared pooled funds as well, which actually can be very much more efficient in getting money out the door. So there are concerns about some of those donors, and often they will pledge money, but it will actually not be forthcoming, so planning is difficult as well.
Do your donors not want you to give or to work nearer to militaries?
It depends on the donor, and it depends on the military. Because militaries are very much, like you were saying today, real militaries, I think you said, sir. The idea of militaries, well, it's very much the same with NGOs. We're quite discriminatory. I think there's, people talk about small NGOs that have stood up overnight, and then you've got others that have had people working them for 40 years as well, developing processes and this kind of stuff. So there is that feeling that there's sort of those that are on the outer as well as those kind of core ones as well.
Managers.
Yeah, well, we try to be inclusive though, so we try not to use that terminology.
Beth, thank you for going easy on me. I appreciate that. Look, clearly the NGO community has come a long way in the last 20 years. One of the issues that occurred in Rwanda was there were so many NGOs who found their way to Rwanda to deliver services that were not needed. There was no engagement with the host country. I mean, there was in fact a government in place, which is why the UN force went in there under Chapter 6, because it was invited in. What has the NGO community done about engaging with host governments in that last 20 years?
Well, again, there's been a very large push towards localisation, which is actually trying to support government services in many ways. Often governments will have a special department that you have to be certified to work in that country, which it varies from government to government, but that's happening more and more. Governments want to know who are coming and what services are going to provide. Haiti is another example, and when there was a massive influx of the numbers of NGO, I think it was more than 3,000 there, and trying to coordinate those was very difficult. But I think this UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, they are also tasked with mapping who is doing what where and getting people to understand that you should only be working off what the needs assessment, which has actually been developed, is. And the idea is if they can pull together the needs assessment, that is taken to donors and presented. And also if people are working outside of that, they can, but it's very clear what the actual priorities are, and people are very much encouraged to work on those. And like you were saying, not actually divert resources elsewhere.
Thank you.
Would you please thank Beth for the presentation?